we've replaced this structural animal spirits narrative with what the animal spirits narrative. The overarching story leading up to the election, tax cuts, reduced regulatory burden, greater M&A, has been replaced by a story of crazy speculation, clown car administration appointments. The S&P's down. We're not off to the races as I think a lot of people thought we would be from the election.
Dr. Ben Hunt, author of Epsilon Theory and co-founder of Second Foundation Partners. It is so great to see you again, Dr. Hunt, and great to welcome you back to the show. We are so excited to have you on.
Great to be back, Julia. And you can't call me Dr. Hunt. I mean, okay. You can call me Ben. But
I'll call you Ben. How about that?
Perfect. Perfect.
I have to say, you were one of my earlier guests, and I don't know if you know that. You were one of the first 15 folks to come on this show and give me a shot back when I didn't have an audience. And so I will always be grateful for that. And I can't believe it's been it's been over 2 years since we last had you on, and you were such a treat. And I'm thrilled to have this audience get to know you. And, one of the things I really admire about your work, Ben, is the way you look at the world and looking at the world through this lens of narratives and the stories that we tell. And the way I usually start this show is with that big picture, more of that macro view where we are today. But I imagine someone like yourself, you look at the world through the lens of what are the narratives that are driving more of that macro picture or the economy today, even markets. Let's throw markets in there. So let's start there. The big picture, the narratives that are driving this. And one of the things about this show, Ben, is you can take all the time you need to set the table.
Yeah, I love that, Julia. And congratulations on the audience you've built. That's
Thank you.
Tremendous accomplishment. And just really hats off for that. It's so difficult to do. It really is. I mean, it's, I think in many respects in this age, it's the most important thing to do to build the opportunity to use your voice, and it's a very difficult thing to do to bootstrap that, which you've done. So congratulations.
Thank you so much.
Really impressive. So I appreciate the opportunity to talk about, let's call it the narratives behind markets. I think it's important though to talk about the narrative of narrative. And what I mean by that is, I started writing about this in 2011. So good 13 years ago. And, when I was writing about it back then, when I started Epsilon Theory, I would have meetings with investors and, some very big famous investors who you all know, and they'd say, well, it's interesting, but that's not what really drives markets. What really drives markets are the fundamentals of cash flows and the like. And so, and here we are 13 years later, and everyone talks about, markets being turned into a political utility, about how the fundamentals don't matter, about how it's narratives all the way down. It's like the narrative, the story about stories has become so dominant. Honestly, too dominant. If you want to know the truth, I think people pay too much attention these days to the story about a stock or a security or whatever. It's taken over and become a thing of its own. And what's fascinating to me about all of this is that I think what's happened in markets, where we're always talking about, okay, what's the narrative of this or that? Two things. First of all, narrative has become a bit of a dirty word, in the sense that people say, if it's a narrative, that means it's constructed and it's essentially a lie. That's how people talk about narratives these days. Well, that's just your narrative, man. Yeah. And I don't think that's right. I think that what narratives really are just the way that we human beings make sense of the world. That there's a layer, and this gets a little out there, but let's go there anyway. Call it the semantic layer of communication information. If you read the articles, the white papers and the like that are written by the large language modelers and the like, they all talk about this semantic layer and semantic dimension of language, because that's what these large language models and generative AI is all about. It's not about doing word search and the specific words you mean. It's what's the meaning that you're trying to get at when you string some words together. We string words together and we listen for words in strings because they fall into patterns that we are hardwired to respond to. So what I'm really interested in now is not this specific narrative around Bitcoin or, around AI as an investable thing. What I'm really interested in is this semantic layer, the semantic dimension, the story about stories, the way that we are hardwired to respond to stories, and how generative AI, ChatGPT, Claude, Genesis, all of these large language models are built around and on top of an understanding of semantics, of the story of story. So I know this sounds kind of woo and kind of out there, but I promise you it's not. I promise you that what I'm describing is at the heart of all of the large language models and the generative AI that is part of our world today. And that what I want to recommend to your audience is to think not just in terms of, I'll call it not a surface interpretation of narrative. What's the story about this or what's the story about that? But to think one layer deeper, to think about the story of stories, think about how stories are created, not in a specific instance, but in the entire edifice of Wall Street. Wall Street is a story construction machine, exactly like Hollywood is, except we know that Hollywood is creating stories. Wall Street is the same way. And once you kind of do the kind of step back and you stop thinking in terms of, oh, I wonder what the narrative of this stock is, and you start thinking about what's the system of narratives that we are immersed in as investors, I think that can really be helpful to give ourselves some critical distance from what's happening, to not let yourself get swept along by this story or that story, to maintain that sort of critical distance that I think is, well, it's always been crucially important, but I think it's even more important as the storytelling machinery takes over more and more of our lives. Let me stop there, Julia, because I worry that I've kind of gone way off the rails here.
No.
But I'd love to kind of hear your thoughts or where you'd want to take it from there.
Okay. So you were the first person who kind of put me on to this of like the narratives that are pretty much everywhere. And so when you look right now at what's happening, maybe let's still stay on the economy and also on markets. Yeah. What are some of those stories that stand out to you today? I imagine, I mean, I could kind of tick through some. Maybe it's the Bitcoin story. What is the Bitcoin story today? It's a big one. The price keeps going up too. I imagine there's a story behind that.
There is. And what I want to encourage everyone to think about is that, yes, there is a number go up story to Bitcoin. And what I want to encourage everyone to think about is, why is that the dominant story? Because there have been other stories around Bitcoin. There was a story around Bitcoin that it was freedom money, that it was outside the system of Wall Street and dollars and investing, that it was a separate thing. There was a story around Bitcoin that it was an alternative transaction medium, that you would use it to buy and sell things. What happened to Bitcoin is now we have a very dominant story, which is that Bitcoin is a very attractive table to play at in the Wall Street casino. This is the number go up story around Bitcoin. It's a very powerful story. What I want to encourage everyone to think of, though, is why is this the dominant story around Bitcoin? And I got to tell you, the reason, I feel confident saying I can tell you why this is the dominant story around Bitcoin. It's because it has been co-opted, engulfed by Wall Street, a story-making machine. And the number go up story is the most powerful story that Wall Street has. It's created because it allows for Wall Street then to be engaged in flow. So Wall Street doesn't care. I promise you, Wall Street does not care. BlackRock does not care whether the price of Bitcoin goes up or down. What they care about enormously is that money flows in and out of Bitcoin. So Wall Street is a flow business. This is why Ken Griffin, you start as running a hedge fund, caring about whether the price goes up or down, and you move into being a market maker. This is why Jeff Yass does the same thing with Susquehanna. You start as a hedge fund caring about does the price go up or down, and you move into the flow business, where you're taking a little piece of every transaction that flows through your pipe. So there's nothing wrong with this. What's important, though, is to recognize that you are part of the system of storytelling. This number go up story is very important, or it's very powerful, but it's not the story that it has permanence to it. It's a story that encourages the flow. So it's not saying to run away from it, to not do it, but to recognize that's what's happening, that you are participating in the number go up story. That's great. Just recognize that's the story that you're participating in, and recognize why you are hearing that story and why that story is dominant, because it serves the interest of both Wall Street and, frankly, Washington. Because every transaction you're making in Bitcoin is, there's nothing, pseudonymous or hidden about it. Bitcoin is no longer any sort of a subversive or system-changing entity. It's another game at the casino. That's great, but just realize that's the story that has taken over, and whose interests are served by that being the story of Bitcoin.
Mm-hmm. And I should also
I don't know, Julie. You're kind of looking at me like this isn't that helpful to you.
No, I'm thinking, I was going to, okay. So my question is, one, I still notice you still have laser eyes. So I take it you recognize the story. I take it, do you own Bitcoin?
We have a little bit because we take subscription fees in Bitcoin. We run a little node and do it. I mean, it's a little bit, but no, Julia, the reason I have laser eyes on my avatar isn't because I'm a number go up guy. I don't care. I don't care. What I care about is that original ethos around Bitcoin, of Bitcoin being about an autonomy, a personal autonomy of mind. I think Bitcoin is wonderfully inventive. It is, and this is my view on Bitcoin, it's good art. And I know people think that that's me putting it down, and actually that's the highest praise I have for anything, is that it's good art. I don't know, Julia. I feel like sometimes that when I talk about this, it's definitely not what people want to hear, because what they want to know is, well, what's your opinion on number go up? And I'm just so bored and tired of that, of all that. I really am. It's not to say that that's not important and people can have opinions on it and all like that. That's all good and true. There is no fundamentals behind Bitcoin. There's not. It's good art, and good art has value. Bitcoin is itself an NFT, a non-fungible token. The Bitcoin. All of Bitcoin is an NFT. It's wonderful art. And that's the source of its value, because good art always has value. But this idea that there's some there with Bitcoin is not true. Now, that doesn't mean the number can't go up. It can. Of course it can. And it doesn't mean that, the free cash flow of company XYZ should have this multiple attached to it, and that's where the value comes from. That's a story too, Julia. That's a story too. What I'm asking people is step back and to see that we are immersed in this world of storytelling, and that the storytellers are in the business of flow. And I think that understanding is something that will help all of us. That the storytellers don't really care about whether number goes up or number goes down. They tell a story of number go up because that is what generates flow. And that's been the source of wealth and power forever. It's that for the storytellers to control flow, that's how the world works. And once you kind of step back to see that, I think that's the most important thing that I can communicate to your audience, as opposed to, here's some flavor of a number go up story. It's to try to communicate that we live in a world of stories, and that the storytellers are all encouraging you to participate in the system with your wallet or with your eyeballs. This is how the world works. And understanding that can give you a much more solid footing as you make your way through that world. I think that's just so much more important than any particular story about number go up or free cash flows or macro this or macro that.
This episode is sponsored by Public.com. You've probably heard a lot about interest rates in the news lately, but even as rates start to fall, there's still time to earn some of the highest yields we've seen in years. Public.com is a powerful platform for investors who are serious about earning fixed income. Here's a quick rundown of 3 yield accounts you can access on Public. First up, the high yield cash account on Public offers a 4.35 APY with 0 fees. That means every cent is yours. Then there's the Treasury account, allowing you to lock in a guaranteed yield with the U.S. Treasuries, widely considered one of the safest investments for your portfolio. And finally, the newest addition, the Bond account, lets you lock in an impressive yield of 6% or higher. If you're looking to earn some steady income even as rates change, head to public.com/Julia. Lock in your yield while rates are still up. Okay, so I imagine too, like some other areas where there's storytelling narratives. Maybe one area I'd love to discuss with you is kind of the narratives that are emerging in this, post-election world. We're shaping up for a new administration to start next year. Curious, like, what are the narratives that you're seeing start to unfold, maybe early innings even?
Well, so what we had, I'll say, since pretty much we saw this since the end of September through the election, was what I'll call the structural animal spirits narrative. Right? What does that mean? This was at the heart of the so-called Trump trade. And the structural animal spirits story was that a Trump victory would bring in structural improvements to the way that markets work that will be good for more money, for making money, right? So what do I mean by structural improvements? I mean, get rid of Lena Khan. Let's allow M&A activity to happen again. Let's extend the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, right? Let's extend the tax cuts. Let's just reduce regulatory impedance, right, on business just wherever it is. So these sort of structural, let's get government out of the picture, let's cut taxes, very kind of old school Republican free market stuff, right? So that's structural animal spirits. And I think that what we saw in a lot of the narratives around markets was, everything was pushing for higher, for number go up, right, across all of markets. Because it's a very powerful story, a very powerful narrative that we're going to unleash American ingenuity, creativity, capital, that it's being held back by taxes, regulation, et cetera, et cetera. All right, so that story we really saw growing from the end of September through the election. Since then, what we've seen is the sentiment and all of the narratives around being bullish around equities, the equity market, really fall off. I mean, it's been a very sharp decline. It really started a week or two before the election and has been really accelerating since then. So that I'll call it sentiment. Our sentiment narratives, are you bullish on the stock market? They've really fallen off. And I think the reason, Julia, is that we've replaced this structural animal spirits narrative with what I'll describe as a what the fuck animal spirits narrative. And what I mean by that is, instead of tax cuts, lower regulatory oversight, increased M&A activity, what that's been replaced with has been Fed politicization, clown car administration appointments, and the crypto speculative craze. Those are not broad market supportive stories. None of those are. I mean, nobody on Wall Street signed up for Matt Gaetz to be, Attorney General. Right? That wasn't part of the plan. That's not part of the structural story that was in the lead up for the election. Nobody on Wall Street wants to see or is excited to see Bitcoin up 35, 40% in 3 weeks. They're fine. We're all fine with the number going up, but this is not sustainable from a flow perspective. This is a very different. It's a WTF animal spirit story as opposed to a structural animal spirit story. So overall, I'm kind of negative on the equity market, on the stock market here. This isn't a forever thing, but the story, the overarching story leading up to the election, tax cuts, reduced regulatory burden, greater M&A, has been replaced by a story of crazy speculation, clown car administration appointments, and it's a very different story. So, I mean, and I think you're really seeing that in markets over the last 2 weeks where, the S&P's down. We're not off to the races as I think a lot of people thought we would be from the election.
Okay. Let me ask you this then. When you recognize these narratives, so first it was structural animal spirits. Now we've moved into WTF animal spirits, as you put it.
Yeah.
I suppose early on in a narrative, you can ride it or benefit from it, but how do you, if you're negative on the equity side of things, like how do you kind of make sure you're kind of near an exit, if you will, if you need to be?
I think you have a situation right now where so many of, I'll call it the larger market participants, want to be close to the exit. And that's a very dangerous situation because once there's a real catalyst, once everybody says, oh my God, we need to go to the exits, everyone's been trying to position themselves to be close to the door, close to the exit. There's both then a stampede for the exit, and the people who get out that exit door are bigger players because they've been jostling their way to be closer to the door. And so their exit then creates even more pressure from the back of the crowd. Oh my God, get me to the exit. It's tough. And this doesn't mean this is what's going to happen, right? Because you can absolutely, the stories, and this is why I think it's so important to pay attention to the machinery of storytelling, right? To not get too close to any particular story, not to take it to heart, not to believe in your heart of hearts, because there is a storytelling machinery in Wall Street, in Washington, Los Angeles to some extent, that you have to be nimble. You really do. To not take any of these stories to heart, but to understand them as stories, to understand that as more people are paying attention to storytelling, and more people are, they want to be closer to the exit. One of the most important lessons I ever learned as an investor is that as an investor, you never push all your chips into the middle of the table. You never go all in. That's such an important lesson, and I think that it's a lesson that a lot of people haven't learned, or have to be, you have to be hit upside the head a couple of times before you do learn it. But you never go all in. This is particularly one of those times not to go all in. And that's the best way to get close to the exit, is not through some fancy hedge, right? Oh, I'm going to hedge my enormous exposure over here with some other thing over there. the best way to hedge is to reduce your gross exposure. It's not to take your net exposure to zero, it's to reduce your gross exposure. That's the best hedge that anyone can do. And if you don't understand those terms, gross exposure and net exposure, then that's even more reason why you should be taking money out of your investments now. Right? Not because that's what gross exposure is. Gross exposure is how much have I got in there. Net exposure is how much I'm long versus how much I'm short. And what I'm telling everyone, particularly your audience, Julia, is that as people are trying to get close to the exit, the best way to get close to the exit is to reduce your gross exposure. That is the answer. It's to sell now while you can instead of trying to sell when you have to. Sell while you can, not when you have to. This is the time to start reducing gross exposure. That's my message to your audience.
Okay. Let me ask you this too about storytelling and narratives, especially like even leading up to the election. I imagine stories can change rather quickly. Is that fair to say?
It's fair to say. I mean, what we find is that when there's some enormous external event, like Russia invades Ukraine, right? It takes about 4 to 5 days for news stories to explain that. So those are those kind of those big exogenous or external shock events. It takes about 4 or 5 days for narratives to form around that. Otherwise, if you've got a narrative, kind of I'll call it a sector narrative. Oh, you need to buy financials because of, I don't know, net interest margins are going up, or a steepening yield curve. Those would be kind of reasons for a financials bullish narrative. Those have a life cycle, right? I mean, and they're usually of a couple of months. So it takes a month, 6 weeks for that narrative to build. It'll hang out there for about a month, and then about a month to 6 weeks for it to decline. So there is absolutely a life cycle. It's not fast twitch stuff. It's not like narratives change overnight, but they definitely have a lifespan of a couple of months. That's what I'd say for people to be looking at.
Okay. Do you think like right now the WTF animal spirits, is that a rather quick development from the structural animal spirits to this WTF?
Yeah, so the structural animal spirits, that took about, started seeing that building in the summer, and then really became very strong around September, then going into really through September, right? Almost right up to the election. And it's really been since the election where you've seen that really start to change. So I think we're still in the early stages of the WTF animal spirits one, right? I think, that's something we've been noticing for the last, call it 2 weeks or so, really since the election. I think it's still got legs. I think it's still got legs.
So if it's still got legs, like, help me understand like what that means to like an everyday individual investor who might be watching this program. Does it mean like does it go higher? Like,
sure.
Is it
here's
the rate of change?
What it means. Here's what it means, Julie. Here's what it means. It means I'm betting, and this works for me too. Look, I've been doing this for 30 years trying to understand narratives, and I get swept up in them too. Mm-hmm. I absolutely do. Right. So none of us are immune to this stuff. And if I come across as say like, oh, I kind of see the narratives, look, I think I see them better than most. But when I say something like, I bet you've kind of taken the Trump narrative to heart, I'm speaking about myself too, because I want to believe in that structural narrative. I want to believe in structural animal spirits. I want to believe that, yeah, you know what? We're going to cut taxes. We're going to allow more M&A activity. We're going to get government off the backs of private enterprise. That's going to be good for investing. And it is. And we want to believe that. What I'm asking everyone to do, what I'm asking your audience to do, is that even if you believe in that, as I do too, allow yourself some critical distance to step back, to think of the world not just as a story being true, but as this whole system of people telling you a story. It doesn't mean they're liars. Narratives are not lies. But when you start looking at the world as a system of storytellers, and that new stories do in fact emerge, even if they are negative, even if they go against the stories that I want to take into my heart, give yourself the freedom and the strength to be able to step back from the stories that you want to believe, like I do. We all want to believe the story of structural improvements to markets. I'm just asking people to understand that story is being molded now, is being shifted, and that my suggestion is to not go all in, not to push all your chips in the table. And instead, I really do think that now's a pretty good time to start taking some of your chips off the table, because that narrative is changing. Mm-hmm. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, totally. Okay. One of the other areas, when I think of storytelling, mm-hmm. I think of news. And you and I have talked about this before, and I thought it was a fascinating concept. Fiat news is how you put it. Can you explain that today? And since it's been over 2 years since we last spoke to you, I mean, I used to be in news. Now I'm a podcaster. And mostly what I use for this platform for is to let my guests talk and just extract as much from them. I don't really opine and give my own opinion at all on the show. But I'm just curious, this concept of fiat news, and maybe more of your take on maybe the evolution of media. I'd just be really curious to hear your thoughts there.
Well, the idea of fiat news is like the idea of fiat money, right? So fiat money, of course, is that there's nothing backing the dollar except the full faith and confidence in the United States government. That's it. It's the words that are the foundation there. There's nothing external that backs the money. And it's the same way, I think, with news today, in that there's no truth there. It's opinion, it's words presented as news. Now, there are structural reasons for that, right? As we developed in our media system, these 24/7 media systems. I guess CNN was probably the first. But then, you've got multiple 24/7 news organizations now. Even the big newspapers, right? Whether it's the Washington Post, the New York Times, those are 24/7 news organizations as well. It's no longer, we publish a morning edition of the paper and maybe an evening edition. That's it. It's 24/7. There's the 24/7 financial news networks now. And because they have to be on all the time, they have to provide content all the time. There's not enough, I'll call it hard news, in the same way we talk about a hard currency. There's not enough gold-backed news, to fill the time. There's just not. Instead, to fill the time, and this is 99% of everything you'll see on CNBC or Bloomberg, it's people giving you their opinion about things. Presented as news. Presented as news. So that's the whole idea of fiat news. It's something that has just been becoming more and more pronounced today. And it's because, and here I'm going to hold up my, I call it my dopamine machine, my smartphone. It's because we now require news, quote unquote, to be presented to us all the time. It's not just that these 24/7 media outlets are there. It's that we insist on injecting ourselves all the time, night and day, with news, right? And of course, it's not news. It's people like me doing their tweets, or Elon, or whoever, right? It's none of this is news. All of this is opinion. And, it doesn't mean it's fake news. It means it's fiat news. In the same way that, the dollars in your wallet, it's not fake money. It's not counterfeit, but it is fiat money. There's no there, except the full faith and confidence of whoever it is who's telling you it's valuable.
Okay. How about more of your take on the evolution of news though today? Like maybe a bit more of like your content diet. Has that shifted in recent years? Just, I don't know if you even have an outlook on news, but if you do, I would love to hear it.
I don't think my outlook on it is any different from anyone else's. I'm an addict to what I get on my smartphone. And I don't mean that in a colloquial sense. I mean it's an actual and real addiction. I think that I have some ability, I think, to read news, absorb news differently than most people. But it all goes back to what I was saying earlier, and what I really wanted to communicate to your audience, which is to see the news not as a collection of stories that you look at and go, oh, okay, that makes sense to me. But to step back a little bit and to ask yourself, why am I reading this now? Someone made a decision to present that news and that story in front of you. It doesn't mean they're lying. It doesn't mean they're lying. It means they're part of a system of storytelling. It's a system that we embrace. It's not an evil or bad system. It's a system you can make money in. But what I'm asking you is to understand that you're part of a system. To give yourself a little room to step back, to always ask yourself, why am I reading this now? And to use that critical distance, not to say no, but to avoid giving your heart to a story, to let yourself say, okay, I'm either going to go with it or I'm not, but I'm making that as a conscious decision. Because it's just going to get worse, Julia. It's just, our use of these dopamine delivery devices or smartphones, the use of 24/7 opinion presented as news, is just becoming more and more the water in which we swim.
Yeah.
It's just the water in which we swim. So it's not going away. We're not going to change it. What we can do, I think the only thing we can do, is to give yourself a little critical distance. Ask yourself, why am I reading this now? And understand you exist within a system of storytelling. Yeah. Do that, and I think it leads to a much healthier and happier life.
I think that's such a good point. It's the water in which we swim. Can I sneak in one more question before you have to go?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So I don't know exactly where I want to go with this, but when we started the conversation, you're talking a lot about the semantic layer and meaning. So I'm wondering, have you observed maybe how maybe language and how meaning has shifted? I don't know if that's even a good question, or can language
That's
be
a great
co-opted?
question.
Okay, because can language just be co-opted for different meanings and purposes?
Oh my God, absolutely.
Okay.
So let me, I use these $10 phrases like semantic dimension or semantic layer.
Well, I work with AI guys, and that's how I got put onto like structured data and unstructured data and semantic layer. So yeah,
right. Yeah. So they talk about this stuff all the time. But let's put it into kind of concrete examples. So what do I mean by a semantic layer? Here's an example of semantics in Wall Street in investing. I'm bullish on the new thing, right? That's a semantic, that's a story, that's a script. It doesn't matter what the new thing is, and there could be a zillion different new things. Right now, the new thing is AI, or the new thing a couple of years ago was crypto. Maybe that's the new thing again. But the storytelling around bullish on the new thing, that's what we mean by a semantic dimension, right? And to your question, Julia, there are a million different ways to communicate bullish on the new thing, a million different words and combinations of words, but it's all still the same story. It all still has the same meaning. And what is amazing about memes, this combination of words and graphics, is that we continue to evolve quicker and quicker ways, more and more direct ways to try to communicate that story, bullish on the new thing. So again, once you kind of step back and you see it as a system of storytelling, and where the goal is just to tell that one particular story, bullish on the new thing, and to mainline that more and more right into our brains, to deliver it with greater and greater doses of dopamine, right? That's what memes are really good at. And that's where all language is going. So, it's just going to get more and more pronounced because it's our brains are defenseless against these more and more effective ways at telling the story, delivering the semantic layer.
Yeah, I think you've left us with so many lessons. We're going to be asking why and what is this story, and giving ourselves that critical distance. And, Ben, I am a paid subscriber to Epsilon Theory, and so are many, many others. I've been a paid subscriber since 2022. And amazing. I want to give you the final few minutes here. Obviously, let folks know where they can find you, read more of your work. Folks, go subscribe. Highly recommend. But anything that you want to leave this audience to think about, any parting thoughts, the floor is all yours.
Well, it is epsilontheory.com, and it's at Epsilon Theory on Twitter, and I'm sure I'll go over to Blue Sky also. But I'm not leaving Twitter. I'm not one of those guys. But yeah, Epsilon Theory is where you can find it, and we do a lot of publishing and writing on these topics. So thank you, Julia, for being a subscriber. I don't have anything closing other than what I've been describing here today. It's always ask yourself, why am I reading this now? Understand that you're part of a system of storytelling. That's what Wall Street is. And seeing that, understanding that the real money is in flow, not in price go up or down, but it's in the flow. Just recognizing that, giving yourself the freedom to step back a little bit from the narratives, even if you want to believe, it'll just make for a much more, it makes for a happier life. There it is. It makes for a happier life.
I love it. Well, Ben Hunt, author of Epsilon Theory and co-founder of Second Foundation Partners, thank you so much for being so generous with your time, your knowledge, your wisdom, all of your lessons. And also thank you for being someone who came on the show in those early days. You are so appreciated. And I just always welcome you on anytime. And thanks again, Ben.
Thank you, Julia. Always a pleasure.